Build Your Business listeners. This is Matt Reynolds, your host for the podcast, and you are listening to what we are calling the legacy episodes. And really, these are the pre-episodes that really led to this podcast, the Build Your Business podcast. This is really my life's work and my brother's life's work in building your business. And so they were originally published in the Barbell Logic podcast as part of the Principles or Coaching Success series, but really touch on similar topics to the Build Your Business podcast: how to improve your productivity, how to set and accomplish your goals, deprioritize urgent tasks, to focus on what is most important to you, and most importantly, to become a better person and leader and business owner overall. I'm proud to bring you these podcasts. Again, many years of life's work, several years of podcasts, and several decades of business ownership. Hope you enjoy them and learn from them. You're listening to Barbell Logic,
the podcast where we talk about what it means to experience strength
and how you can use simple, hard, and effective strategies in training and nutrition to improve your life.
It starts with meeting you where you are right now and finding lasting solutions.
Welcome to the show. You're listening to the Barbell Logic podcast. I'm your host, Matt Reynolds. This is another episode of the Coaching Success series. Today, I've got a very special guest, a guy that's become a friend of mine over the last year. He has a very similar family tree as us, lots of co-friends and mentors, and he is an assistant professor at West Point, Greg Hess. He's also an athletic trainer, strength coach, and really probably the biggest strength evangelist at West Point. And so, hey, man, welcome to the show.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity. Looking forward to conversation. Yeah.
Excited to have you on. And Dan, Shell, and I, most of our listeners know who he is. We went to kind of a holistic fitness health event a few months ago, and you were speaking on strength, and I had no idea. And then you got up and in your presentation, you talked about Jonathan Sullivan and the Blue Book and all this. And I was like, who is this guy?
Right.
By the way, for those of you, most of you are listening to this, like Greg is uber jacked, looks the part, talks the part, had a great presentation. And Dan and I were like, we got to get this guy on the podcast and just talk about what he's doing with strength at West Point. And so, we've talked about for years, and I'll say this so you don't have to. You are a civilian, so
yes.
Which is good. So we've talked for years about the need for strength for the warfighter. And you were actually able to implement some of that with some of these West Point cadets, or a lot of these West Point cadets. So I want to start first to kind of establish some of your background.
Sure.
What is your background in strength training? Again, I know you're an athletic trainer,
right?
Kind of educational background. And what does that process look like for you? Just in a few minutes to give the listeners an overview of who you are.
Sure. So just finishing up my 14th year at West Point. So I came on board about August of 2010. Preceding that, I was working as an athletic trainer at a small D3 school up in New Hampshire. Before that, I worked at the University of Pittsburgh with their women's gymnastics team for a couple of years. So I learned of the West Point program and kind of the novelty or the uniqueness of it, because it's a dual-hatted type position where I can not only teach in the Department of Physical Education, which we call DPE, but I also have a kind of an emergent medical requirement or role at West Point. So in addition to like all the strength stuff we're going to be speaking about today and kind of the initiatives there, I also am a athletic trainer by trade, by education, where at West Point we deal with treatment and triage of a lot of the acute injuries that we see, things like head injuries, things like dislocated shoulders, sprained ankles. We don't necessarily do a lot of the rehab because we work hand in hand with physical therapists. But what we do focus on is that immediate care and treatment of those injuries. But going from that, it's kind of interesting to see that's very reactive in nature. Whereas I think, as you heard me speak at the H2F symposium there in Virginia, taking a step towards the strength side of things, it's much more proactive in nature. So that's kind of the long and short of kind of where I came from, athletic trainer by trade. And as a lot of us in that setting get the opportunity to teach, instruct, and we kind of find our own little niche, if you will. And we quickly learned that we really like instruction. We like interaction, especially with the cadet population. It's very rewarding from both a mentor side of things and self-growth side of things as well. You're challenged every single day.
Sure.
So that's really the long and short of it for me. From a strength training perspective, I was first introduced to some of the kind of the basic barbell movements, yes, in undergrad. But I think, again, as I mentioned, obtaining and achieving like something like a NSCA CSCS, well, it's great on paper and it's kind of the industry standard, so to speak. It really lacks for a clinical or a
Practical.
hands-on practical application, really.
Yeah.
Which is, it's like you don't know what you don't know until you realize you don't know it. And I kind of came to that realization at West Point because there are a couple folks teaching one of the classes I currently direct, course director for a couple courses at West Point. The specific class is called Strength Development. And in that class, we teach the 4 basic barbell movements plus the power clean plus the power snatch. So we teach the squat press, deadlift, bench press, and then we teach, if not maybe expose them, is maybe more accurate, to the power derivatives. So the power clean, power snatch, just because the cadets see it, they want to be able to do it. So it's one of those things where I want to give them a little bit of knowledge on kind of the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of those movements as well. So not getting too far off track, once I got an understanding of simple's okay, basics okay, you can make a lot of progress, especially from a novice perspective. I kind of took that material and started to run with it. And in the last, probably about 5 years ago now, I was given an opportunity to take that class over after a little bit of like, hey, I want to do this. I want to do this. Here's why I want to do it. I was able to maintain that class a little bit better because it hadn't been maintained really well, to the point where we were getting away from maybe the basics. They were trying to do things that are novel and, super sexy potentially, that didn't need to be that way. So I took over the class. The class is based on those 4 movements plus those 2 power derivatives. We utilize the Blue Book within reason for our cadet population. But that's kind of like how I got into this strength instructional area, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. And just also, you're obviously a strength enthusiast yourself, right? Like,
Sure.
I mean, you train, you're jacked. Like, and I don't normally ask people this when I interview them, but like, do you have some numbers you want to throw out? Like, first off, I also don't ask this. How old are you?
I'm 39.
I'm going to say we're close in age.
Closer.
Yeah. Yeah, closer. You still have hair. I don't. But yours will go in the next 10 years, and then you'll look more like me. You'll shave the head, and then you'll grow the beard out a little more. So yeah, what are some of your lifting accolades? Have you competed in any, like in powerlifting or any of the strength sports? What are you most proud of?
So honestly, I haven't competed a whole lot from in a strength lifting or even powerlifting type of perspective. The only actual competition I did was a partner lifting meet down in Baltimore. I think it was a place called 5x3.
Yeah.
Down in Baltimore. They had a charity event, and
Emily and Diego's place.
Yep.
Great gym.
Yep. So I PR'd my 1RM deadlift there. I pulled 505, and I think I benched like mid 3s.
And your frame's not very big, right? You're not 6 foot tall.
No, I'm 5'10" on a good day and probably hovering right around 200 pounds. Yeah.
2.5x body weight deadlift, which is pretty solid. And you're very lean.
Yeah.
I mean, you look like, I actually don't know your competitive background. It would not have surprised me if you'd said like, yeah, I've done a couple amateur bodybuilding shows or powerlifting or strongman or anything, but you've kind of got that look of, and it's not a jack of all trades, master of none, but you have, I think one of the things that impressed us is that you have the look that I think most, especially men, I assume most middle-aged women don't want to look like you or me.
Yeah.
But I think most middle-aged guys would look at you and be like, I want to look like that guy. And you're like, yeah, I just train for strength and I still do conditioning and I eat clean and I'm pretty lean. And so like you don't just talk the talk, and you're not just the professor in the classroom, you're the coach in the gym, but you also practice this in your daily life.
To be completely honest, I'm a little bit of a recovering endurance type guy.
Okay.
I've done a couple I've never done a full marathon. I've done a couple halves, and this was like 10, 12, 15 years ago now. But the thing I finally realized is that is so time consuming.
Yeah.
It's like chasing your tail like a dog, right? It's like, hey, I want to get better at this. And there's at a point in time, I was pretty good at it. I mean, I was running like a half marathon at like an hour and a half pace.
Jeez.
Like I was beating the what out of myself.
Sure. What'd you weigh then?
Probably like 175 or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, life happened, kids happened. I had to take a hard look at myself. I'm like, as we talk about it, what is the, you know, lowest effective dosage on some of this stuff? What can I do to still improve, still make progress from a, mental perspective, but also, be able to have time to do other things in my life. And I quickly, where I am kind of now with training, I use like a 4-day split,
That's my favorite.
upper lower, presses heavy one day, presses lighter the other day, or I prioritize, like a pull or a squat versus opposing days.
Yep.
But I also do some I become a fan from a conditioning standpoint. I love the sled, be it a prowler, be it a push pull, quick, simple, dirty. It feels like I'm doing something. Again, a lot more mental than anything.
Low skill, low impact. So low injury rate.
Yeah. And I also like using like the air bike as well.
Oh, you're crazy. That thing sucks.
It's one of those things where I think I'm addicted to endorphins.
Yeah.
I just like a bit masochistic in a way.
Yeah. I've got the Rogue. What's the Rogue one called?
Echo bike.
I got the Echo bike. I've got you can barely see the Peloton, which
Yeah.
rarely gets used. That's when it's, -5 outside.
Sure.
And I'm like, I'm not walking around the neighborhood or going out in the garage and doing that stuff. So,
Right.
and the Prowler, I loved the Prowler for years. I did the Prowler like crazy. That was my primary form of conditioning when I was a pro strongman, because it just, again, was low impact, low skill. You think about strongman is so high impact. You're doing heavy farmers, heavy yoke, tire flips, which you could tear a bicep on. You could do a Prowler or a C2 rower or an air bike, and it's low skill, low impact, and you can ramp your heart rate up to 180 on those things. And you can put anybody on it. You can hit it hard, and you don't have to worry about teaching them form and all that sort of stuff. So you've taken this. So again, hopefully I think you've established that we're cut from a similar cloth. It's simple, hard, effective. It's minimum effective dose. You've taken that philosophy into West Point over the last, decade.
That's crazy to think about.
And you really, yeah, isn't that crazy? I know Barbell Logic's we're about to hit our 10-year anniversary, and I can't believe we're 10 years old. And so you really have, well, first off, a couple things without rabbit trailing too much.
Sure.
The athletic trainer side of you is interesting because you get the first interaction with an injured soldier, warfighter, student, cadet, and then often that gets handed off to physical therapy. And then as you've brought in the strength, you kind of bookend. You're like the first, but then you're also the continuation long game if it's taken well. That, okay, and we see this all the time. Like somebody hurts himself, and they go to the doctor, they go to the orthopedic surgeon. For a cadet or a warfighter, they're going to see an athletic trainer. The Olympics are going on right now.
Sure.
Somebody has an injury, the athletic trainers rush to them, they do the thing, they tape up the calf or the Achilles, and then there is going to be physical therapy in another week when the Olympics are over, and then it's going to be re-strengthening the body. And so you kind of hit the bookends with the physical therapy in the middle. Is that fair?
That's fair. I would say that may be too kind to what we actually do.
Well, let's just be kind.
And we can be kind. So what it actually looks like is, let's use a good example. So there's a gymnastics course we teach. It's called military movement. We call it PE 117 just because that's its course number. Old grads, so the graduates of the academy might know it as gymnastics. It's basically gymnastics, but we call it military movement because, yeah. And there's things like vertical ropes, horizontal ropes. There's a bit of vaulting. There's tumbling. There's things like handstands. There's trampolines.
Nice.
Believe it or not. Enormous trampolines. I walk in there. Sometimes it's like, what is happening? It's like, sometimes it's like the circus. It's controlled. It's super controlled. Like they lock the trampolines up at night and stuff. But so let's say we get like a shoulder or ankle injury in there. They come down. We triage them, probably give them, we probably give them more verbal guidance versus anything else. Like, hey, this is what I think it is. This is your next step. And we hand them off to physical therapy. They go to a sit call, they get imaging, because we as athletic trainers, at least at West Point, while we like to think we're medical providers, the Army and the DoD doesn't necessarily consider us in our setting like medical providers. Like we don't access the same healthcare system. So if I wanted to get imaging on somebody, I have no jurisdiction to do so.
Right. You'd have to hope that they can go to a doctor, go get that done.
So we work hand in hand with physical therapy. They're great next door, and they do your typical outpatient physical therapy type stuff, right?
Yep.
And it depends, like the severity of the injury. It also depends, like if it's a surgical situation, that's a whole nother ball game, because being at West Point, it's a very teaching hospital, if you will. So they like to do a lot of orthopedic interventions.
Yep.
So there's that. So that's super proximal.
And also better, I would assume, on the private sector, which is if you go see an orthopedic surgeon, they're almost always going to lean into orthopedic surgery because that's how they make their money. At West Point, it's like, what are the interventions we can do with these cadets to get them back into the field as quickly as possible if that doesn't require surgery?
That's also true, but because it is a teaching hospital, they like to get surgeries under their belt too.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
It depends.
You get both.
You get both. So then when they're done with, maybe they have a surgery, they have a knee, whatever, ACL, they'll go through the typical 6-8 months of physical therapy. We say next door because it literally is like one petition over from our office. And they'll be doing their typical PT stuff. And then unfortunately, kind of like one of the things I had in my mind going into our talk is one of kind of the missing factors, at least at West Point, is that continuation of care. Like we don't necessarily have dedicated strength conditioning professionals to pick up the rehab and then run with it. Like there's no, like the continuation of care isn't necessarily there. So sometimes physical therapy continues that, but a lot of times it is at the discretion of the individual cadet to continue that process. And sometimes that's where folks like myself and my colleagues, we can step in and say, okay, you know what? Your band resistance TKE is probably not cutting it anymore for your ACL since you've been like 6-8 months out. Can I please talk to you about a barbell squat?
Yeah, right. Can we get your hamstring strong at this point?
Can we do something that's, I hate the term functional because it's like one of those like functional.
Yeah, no, I know. Sure.
Functional core, sport specific. It's all like cringy to me, but it would be nice to have a continuation of care that goes beyond kind of the basics of, okay, their activities of daily living, check the box. They can do all of those things. Now what? And unfortunately, as you mentioned, the Holistic Health and Fitness Initiative, what the Army calls H2F, is trying to get some of these professionals, and they do exist, but trying to get some of these multidisciplinary professionals like athletic trainers, physical therapists, dietitians, strength coaches, you can keep naming these professions, embedded with units. While we have all of these entities at West Point, unfortunately, they all work for somebody different.
Yep.
While we communicate, there's not like, okay, now it's time for the strength coach to take over, unless they're a Division I athlete.
Right.
Because there are different types of cadets, believe it or not.
Sure. Yeah. If you play football for the football team, that's going to be different. Makes sense.
You are a different specimen, 100%.
Right.
Yes.
Which is actually true, in fact.
Yes.
That you are. And I think the thing for the average, not the Division I athlete, but for the average cadet or even the average person, we know that the best predictor of future injury is past injury, right?
Sure.
So this is why we see people tear their ACL numerous times. And there's certain surgeries, like if you tear your bicep tendon, the surgery is so good, you rarely tear your bicep tendon a second time. But we see MCLs and ACLs and ankle, all that kind of stuff. So the physical therapist will often get them back to kind of like baseline.
Right.
But then they go out and they do crazy stuff again, like out in the field, which is what you're called to do as a cadet and a future warfighter.
Yeah.
And they hurt themselves again. And it's often the same injury. So if they can take that into the strength field, they can protect themselves and become more resilient and less vulnerable to future injury, knowing that that is the step you have to take. And so
correct.
I'd like to transition a little bit and just for a few minutes, because I really want to dive into the strength development class that you're teaching. But before we get there, your first interaction, all cadets, as they come in their initial kind of onboarding as plebes, which are basically freshmen, right? Is that fair to say?
I was just going to say, like a plebe cadet would also be known as a fourth class cadet, and a senior is a first class cadet, as kind of flipped as that seems. Just throwing that out there.
So 4, 3, 2, 1, they work their way down in number, but
exactly,
it's a newbie and that's not a derogatory term, but
yes,
they have this kind of holistic health and fitness course they have to take. Is that correct? And
correct.
One thing that you've done, I'd love to hear just really briefly, like 3 minutes maybe, on what that looks like, and then how you've started to integrate strength into that, knowing that they have So the Army has all of these, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, even, and all of those things, how you've started to integrate into the curriculum the importance of strength training for everyone. And that is a mandatory class that everyone at West Point has to take, correct?
Correct. So I'm a course director, as we call it at West Point. It's a mandatory core course. It's called, depending upon who you're talking to, it's either Fundamentals of Personal Fitness or Foundations of Personal Fitness. It's written both ways, different places. So I'll just call it Foundations of Personal Fitness. We also call it PE 215 affectionately, because again, that's the course number. But so this course is kind of built with those H2F domains in mind. So the domains are the physical, the spiritual, the nutrition, mental readiness, and sleep readiness as well. So all of those kind of combine together to make an optimal physical and mental and spiritual readiness outcome. So like you can't be physically your best without being good and mentally, versus if you don't get enough sleep, you're not going to recover. So they all piggybacks off of one another, which makes sense.
Sure.
So in that class, while we cover all of those 5 domains, some more in-depthly than the others. So we cover the physical, as you can imagine, from the Department of Physical Education. We try to hit that pretty in-depth. Whereas something like the spiritual readiness component, like, well, this exists. What do you think? And then we have a discussion based upon that.
It's more based on the individual.
100%, yeah. And kind of the auxiliary type things are the sleep and the nutrition, and we have a whole assignment for that. So we cover all of these areas really well, in my opinion. But specific to the physical domain, we have a battery of tests that all cadets have to engage in, and they get graded on their physical performance. Those tests are, as I'm sure we'll talk about, there's a 3-rep conventional deadlift. So we don't use the trap bar anymore, because I think, conventional's a little bit more effective.
Sure.
There's a concept 2 ergometer. There's a 500-meter row. We also do a beep test. So the pacer test, the beep test, if you remember what that is.
Yep.
We do a metronome bench press test. We kind of use that as a muscular endurance modality.
Same weight for everybody, or
for men, it's 95 pounds. And for women, I think it's 40. And it's like
oof.
An insane amount of reps.
Yeah, they're doing tons of reps.
Yeah, it's
okay. Yeah.
Do 65 repetitions and good luck.
Bro. And to be sore for 2 weeks.
Yeah. There's a standing long jump as well.
Okay.
And we do pull-ups. We do pull-ups as well, and they can pre and post-test pull-ups. But long story short is we use the deadlift event and the bench press event in that battery of tests as an opportunity to teach those movement patterns, right? It might, it's from a technical proficiency standard, it's a 101 overview.
Sure.
But they honestly probably don't get it anywhere else. So this is a grassroots effort, to be completely honest, to try to embed some of these basic barbell human movement patterns into a mandatory class at the United States Military Academy.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
We're trying. And where we don't necessarily overtly teach it, I teach it in my sections, and I know I have colleagues who teach it as well. It's like the standing press, the press, and the squat don't necessarily get the attention they deserve.
Sure.
However, there are opportunities within the class and recommendations for, hey, when you teach the bench press, you could use that same day. Guess what? You could stand them up and you can teach the press. Or, oh, you want to teach the squat this day? Guess what? The squat's already set up for the press. Let's do both in the same, hour period. So there are opportunities to do that for sure. So that's kind of an initiative that I've kind of tried to push a little bit. A little bit is mandatory from a battery of tests that they have to do. All instructors have to teach those. But it's still, again, it's a little bit of a grassroots effort to embed those. So
yeah, that makes sense. And I know, because we've talked, we know that and believe that strength improves all of those facets, right? Not to the final degree. Like, you can't just squat and deadlift and then go run a marathon. But for someone who is untrained, for a kid who's never lifted or never done anything really hard, the best bang for our buck is in the strength training.
Yeah, for sure.
So then moving into, I think what's the most interesting piece then is there's this elective course that you teach, right? The strength development course.
Yes.
I don't want to needle you on this, but if I were you, when I'm teaching the mandatory course, I'm using that as a quote unquote sales pitch for, hey, you like the barbells? You should take this elective course where we teach you how to get strong and we teach you all the basic lifts.
So it's funny you say that. One of the regular feedback we get from course end feedback from not only the strength development class, which I'll talk about in a second, but also like the sections I and my colleagues that I'm pretty close with that we teach in the foundations of personal fitness classes. We like how we were taught these movements. Why isn't this more of a mandatory part of the class? It's like, well, we're trying.
Yeah.
Like you can only jam, so much in the rucksack, right? You can't
Yeah.
put 500 pounds in a 100-pound rucksack. You'd be extreme.
Right.
It's an inch deep, mile wide. And unfortunately, we don't have an opportunity to expand the class past 19 lessons, which it currently is. All of our classes in DPE are 19 lessons, about 55 minutes. We have 4 rounds per year, typically. So 2 in the first term, 2 in the second term. So we're a little handcuffed there, but you're right. It's a sales pitch. Every time I get an opportunity to teach, not just in a classroom setting, but also we deal with the intramural program at West Point. It's a sales pitch like, hey, if you guys really want to get into this, there's a whole class about it. And guess who teaches it? This guy. You're going to get more of this.
Like the jacked guy? Okay, I'll learn from that guy.
It's me in a pulpit, like literally like on a plyo box, like prophesizing.
Yeah,
That's how
I
it
love
turns
it.
out. It's kind of funny.
So walk me through that course a little bit. So this is an elective course. Like you said, it's 19 sessions with these cadets over like 8 weeks, 9 weeks, something like that, right? So, and you're running them really basically through a novice linear progression.
We do.
With a focus on technique first.
Yep.
I'm sure consistency is a big part of that. They've got to show up and do the thing. And over time, I'm sure you're seeing fairly adequate, if not moderate, strength success and trying to set them up to be able to continue to do this after the course. Because obviously, 8-9 weeks is like you can make a big difference in certainly technique and consistency and habit and even strength gains. But ultimately, you're trying to teach them the long game here. So what does that course actually look like? I know you said it's not in the classroom. That classroom is the weight room.
Correct. So again, that class is a 19 lesson class. It's an elective. It's actually one of what we call the lifetime physical activity courses. So it fulfills a requirement during their either Cal or first year, depending upon if they can make ahead or if they have to take it as a senior. They have to take one of these type of classes. So the variety of these classes include things like basketball, volleyball, strength development, badminton, pickleball, skiing, snowboarding. We have a ski mountain like right outside Post. It's kind of cool.
Crazy.
So I actually used to be the course director for skiing as well until I took over one of the other classes. And they're like, yeah, maybe you shouldn't do all of this stuff. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. Let me give some of that to somebody else. Anyways, so the strength development class, while the course learning outcomes aren't necessarily performance based, they're more geared towards, like everything at the academy is geared towards character and leadership. So we try to thread that through wherever possible. And I think it's a great opportunity to do that. So our course learning outcomes are things like learn the lift proficiently, be able to interact with a peer. Peer coaching is a huge course learning outcome. Being able to make modifications for that peer, being able to program at a very basic level, right?
Sure.
And also, is it important for you to progress? Yes, no, but we want you to lift correctly from a safety perspective as well.
Sure.
Because you can probably imagine it's not that different than a normal college campus between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon or even the evening. It's the Wild West in that weight room. It's like one of those, internet memes where like the guy's looking around is like, what is happening?
Yeah.
It's to that level sometimes. It's not all the time like that, but sometimes I'm like, why are you doing heel elevated split squat, whatever, with a 20-pound dumbbell thing? I'm like, what? How about you just get under a bar and take it up 5 pounds a workout?
So it's like going into a Lifetime Fitness in the private world, right?
Oh,
like,
for sure.
How big is the gym? Do you know, like on the square footage? Because I've been to some of these. Like I remember going to the big one at Hill or whatever, and I was like, whoa, this thing is massive. I mean, it's the size of a Sam's or a Costco.
Yeah, it's pretty big. So they just redid 1, 2, 3. We have like 4 or 5 different weight. There's like a CrossFit area too. Like they're all in different levels. You can tell this is a government building because nothing's together.
Right.
But they just got all new Sorinex equipment.
Oh, nice.
So that's kind of the level of the quality. I think in the weight room we teach strength development in, I think there's somewhere around like 32 racks maybe.
Oh, wow.
So they're half racks.
And that's one of the 4 strength training rooms. So there's a bunch of racks in this place.
We probably have close to 100 racks in the building.
Wow.
But they're not all together.
Sure. Of course. That's insane though.
So in this space, we call it the third floor weight room. We're able to kind of be in one row So we're able to see the front and the back. We have the deadlifters face each other. Obviously, the squat face opposite, but it gives that good coaching perspective from that 45-degree angle. You can see a lot at one point, and you can intervene and kind of triage where you need to.
Yeah.
It's usually from an instructor to cadet ratio. It's like a 1-10, so 2-20 ratio. It's a lot of triage.
So doable.
It's not, especially when we're kind of baby stepping them with each movement. So into the actual outline of the class, we do an introduction. We kind of do the sales pitch of why strength's important. We get a lot of buy-in. We get them fired up. I'm pretty introverted normally, but it's kind of my extrovert. I jump on stuff and I get like, why do you think you need to do all this crazy stuff? It's actually entertaining to me thinking about how sometimes I act in that class, because like that's not normally me, but it's me on stage, really.
I love it.
So the first lift, we'll take a day to teach the squat, probably without maybe even putting any weight on the bar.
Sure.
Then we'll go into I think we do the press, then we'll do the deadlift. So that's lessons to lesson 4. So that's 4 lessons. We've done 3 lifts.
Yep.
Then we do a workout where it incorporates the squat, the press, and the deadlift. Very novice linear type progression. And then we'll teach the bench press on lesson like 6. Lesson 7, I believe, we'll teaching the power clean.
Okay.
And the progression there from the rack position the whole way, taking it down to the floor and tacking a deadlift onto it.
By the way, we had talked about this, that, I think we get the rap at Barbell Logic for not liking the power clean or the clean and jerk or the snatch. And that's actually not true. In fact, that's my favorite part of the Olympics, is to watch that. The reality is that when your average client at Barbell Logic is someone in their mid 40s,
right,
it's the skill and time necessary to teach it for the return on investment. So often what we found is when we teach the power clean, someone might be deadlifting 315 and they're power cleaning 95. And the form might be fine, but we're not really getting a strength adaptation with a 95-pound clean. If anyone should be cleaning or snatching, I would argue you're talking about 19-year-old future warfighters. Like, these are the types of people who should be doing this very thing.
Yes, I agree with that. But even with this population, you might be surprised at how much they're leaving on the table if you start embedding a power clean or a snatch prematurely.
Sure.
In my opinion, with this group, if you have a 150-pound male who is getting close to a 225, 250 deadlift, and they're recovering from it, and they can progress that twice a week, I'm going to have them run that out until...
Yeah, just keep deadlifting.
Just keep deadlifting. And I think that's one of the things with this population as well. They see all this stuff like, oh, I need to be doing that.
Yeah.
And yes, we teach the power clean and the power snatch because they're going to do it. Let's teach them how to do it properly.
Sure.
But from a programmatic standpoint, I think there's still some misconception like, oh, I need to do these complex Olympic lifts to improve my physical performance. And it's like, that's great. I think that's a way that's better than not touching progressive barbell training.
Yeah.
But there's a better way, and it's super simple.
That's right.
Again, I get a lot of cadets who have more experience doing like power cleans than like a squat. I'm like, because that's what their friends do. It's like, well, it works more muscle mass. I'm like, but it's a display of your strength.
That's exactly right. It's not really training.
Let's get your strength up and see what happens. And that's one of the huge conversations I have, or we have, when we start introducing these power derivatives is, you've heard it. We've all heard it. What's the best way to get your power clean up? Get your deadlift up. It's like, yes. And once that starts connecting, like you can just tell the light bulb starts going off for some of them. They're like, oh, you mean I don't need to do all of this extra stuff? I'm like, no, in a way, some of it's kind of self-entertainment for a lot of them.
Sure.
And it's better than not doing.
Keeping some variation, keeping it exciting.
Yeah. At the academy, we're super pampered. Sometimes I'm kind of naive to like what normal is like in society. And when I walk into the weight room, even if it is, Barnum and Bailey circus going on, it's still, they're doing something. They're making progress versus they're not sitting on a device or
swiping TikTok. They're actually in there at least trying. So you have people who are learning from good coaches, trainers, professors, what they should actually be doing. And you have the other people who are still trying to exercise to the best of their abilities, and where they are not doing it well, it's really ignorance. It's not out of laziness. It's not because they would rather be on their phone doing TikTok.
It's a little bit of ignorance, I think, but I think it's also sometimes It's, I hate to say it, but sometimes like it's almost easier. The best example I have of this, I was lifting one day in a different weight room, same building, and the trendy like hip thrust movement, right?
Oh yeah.
So there's a lady, female cadet, had, I think it was a 45-pound bar and tens on, right? So she's doing hip thrusts with 65 pounds.
65, right.
And this just goes to show the disconnect. She gets a call on her phone. You can tell it's urgent. If it was her like TAC officer, so the
Sure.
person who's in charge of her company, like you could tell she needed to go and do something now. So in order to clean up, what'd she do? She curled the bar up, put it in the rack like that. I'm like, that intensity that you're doing hip thrusts with, you just curled it with ease and put it in the rack. It's not doing what you think it's doing.
Yeah, I should quadruple the weight on that thing. Right.
Sometimes there's not an understanding of it needs to be heavy.
Yeah.
Because again, lowest effective dosage, how many hip thrusts you're going to do? Like 30?
Right, sure.
So there's kind of this aesthetic type thing you're dealing with. You're definitely dealing with some of the hypertrophy driven type stuff, which has its place potentially. But again, the baseline of the cadet population is not that dissimilar to like a high school sports program, right?
That's right. Got to get stronger.
They just need to get stronger.
But what they want is they want to like, oh, I saw this NFL player or this Division I player doing this thing. And you're like, bro, you're 14.
That's not you.
You're 14 years old and you are as painfully average as it gets genetically, right? So the best thing that we can do to make you better on the football field is get you strong in the weight room and then practice on the football field. It's literally those two things, right? Like that's the thing.
That's a huge piece that we talk about too, the difference between training and exercise or training and practice, and things need not look like they're sport in the weight room, right?
Correct.
So you don't need to replicate things. The time for some of the conditioning that they do, it's embedded into their practice. So a good example, there's something called the Sandhurst competition. Sandhurst is a United Kingdom, their military school. It is a military skills competition that's at West Point actually every year, every spring. So each company, so 36 companies, plus there are a couple companies that are super competitive, that are kind of like the super special, like the really good ones. And then other Sandhurst teams come from other countries as well. It's an international event that comes to West Point. So they do things like land navigation, they do orienteering, they do like, you think of like David Goggins and carry the boat, like stuff like that, right? It's like
practice,
kind of like boot campish. Yeah, it's practice. And they beat the you know what out of themselves to a point where it kind of becomes a non-sustainable return.
Of course.
And I have some of these individuals in the class and they start talking about what they're doing to prepare. And again, there's just a disconnect between training, practice, and what's going to make them physiologically better and what's going to make them skill better.
Sure.
Now, I will say some of the time, the grit and the mental toughness piece comes from some of that engagement in some of these tasks that are hard, do the things that are hard, 100%.
Of course.
However, you can't do that all the time, right? You can't always be sleep deprived.
That's right.
You know what's going to happen if you're always sleep deprived? Well, something bad is going to happen.
Yeah.
So accidents and whatnot. But kind of back to the strength development class, the outcomes, the course learning objectives are directly geared towards, there are 2 tests that we do based on material that they have to read in the class. So there's actually kind of like a cognitive academic piece to it as well. They're required to coach a peer on one of the movements.
By the way, I love that. I didn't know that about it. And it makes sense if you've got 1-to-10 ratio. You're not just teaching these cadets how to lift, you're also teaching them, you're refining their coaching eye.
Yes, 100%.
To coach their peer. Like, I love that that's part of it. That was something that I didn't, by the time, I was a head strength coach at a big high school for 10 years. By the time kids were 17, 18 years old, juniors, seniors, certainly they were jumping in and coaching. But, with your average 14-year-old kid who couldn't chew bubblegum and walk,
yep,
like they couldn't even get in an athletic position, let alone coach an athletic position. So I love that you've got a higher level of person as well, right? And again,
sure,
my perception of that, maybe yours might not be as high, but I'm like, look, these are highly intelligent kids. They've worked their butt off to get there. They're highly motivated. Therefore, like, we don't just have to teach them how to lift, we can teach them how to coach. And again, in the standard's not 100%, it's probably 90 or 85% or whatever that is.
What that's called to me, that's character development, that's leadership, that's personal peer courage. That's your ability to interact with another human being and say, hey, how do I interact with this person appropriately and make a change?
Yep, that's right.
behavior change at its finest, right?
That's right.
One of the other tested things in the class, the final thing that they do is a video feedback. So they'll take a video of a peer.
Ooh, nice.
And again, it's not necessarily teaching on the platform, because the teaching on the platform in person is geared towards a never ever, like teach somebody how to squat. They've never touched a barbell before.
Sure.
Versus this online, it's really a video critiquing is, okay, now take that squat. This person should know what they're doing. Let's find some errors. Why are they errors? That's a huge piece, because like, oh, this,
Sure.
they're not to depth. Why? And then how do you make the intervention? How do you make the correction? What would you do?
How do you fix it? What's the cue? I love it.
So that's kind of the fourth thing that we grade in this class. In addition, we talked about this before, just because there's no grade necessarily geared towards performance, we do provide some extra effort or bonus points towards achieving like 1,000-pound club for men across the 4 lifts at a 5 rep per set.
Yep.
So
it's not a 1 rep max, but a 5 rep.
Correct.
1,000 pounds. It's pretty good.
It's a game changer a little bit. And I think that it's 750 for women.
You said you give bonus points for the power movements?
And we give an additional bonus point if they can, for 3 reps, clean 50% of their deadlift intensity. It's kind of an attempt on my end.
By the way, that's pretty good.
To be completely honest, most of them, I don't know. I have to think about this again, but some of them maybe are sandbagging their deadlift a little bit. I
was going to say, like, my best deadlift was 725. I never cleaned. And then when I became a strongman, because strongman has some versions of clean, I started cleaning, and I didn't train the clean very long, but I trained it hard enough that I got my clean up to 330 or 335. So that's still well under 50% of my 1 rep. And that's 1 rep to 1 rep. And so, 50%. And what we found for strength improvement for people who are doing power movements is you really are trying to get up to close to 70, between 60 and 70% of your deadlift max. You take these guys early in the Olympics right now, they're deadlifting 800 pounds, 750, and they're clean and jerking over 500, 550.
It's crazy.
Up to almost like 600 may get broken this week. I mean, that's crazy. And so, that percentage is, but 50% for a triple is pretty dang good. Like, that's pretty strong.
So a normal male, kind of my anecdotal. So the numbers will typically look like this for a normal, fairly, I don't say like we get some Division I athletes in this class as well, but kind of like an overall average, you probably are pressing close to like 150 for 5.
Okay.
They're probably benching maybe close to 185, close to 200 maybe for a set of 5. They're squatting 225, 250 maybe. They're pulling 3 plates. They're getting up to like 315 plus.
So they can clean 165-ish, whatever.
Exactly.
That's kind of the ballpark. But I mean, again, in 19 sessions, that's a lot of progress. So even though you said performance progress is not maybe in the top 1, 2, 3 goals, you're still seeing it. So as we wrap this up, I'd be interested, how's it been? Like, first off, you have on average about 20 cadets per class. Is that right?
Yeah. So in this elective strength development class is about 20 per class. And that equates to about maybe 80 to 100 a year that are taking this elective, if not more. We've also done some grassroots workshops on the weekends as well. Well, we'll teach the same movements, like in the 3-hour workshop block.
Yep.
We'll teach 3 or 4 of the movements, have them train it. The problem we ran into with those workshops is the same folks were interested coming back like every month, and they wanted something new. Like, well,
right.
No, like I don't have anything shiny for you.
Like, we're teaching you the basics. Now you go off, and that makes sense.
This is a form check of sorts. And that was kind of like, oh.
Yeah.
So that's one of the main barriers I'm seeing is like, it's, like boring for them a little bit. And you got to have either educate them on how they're going to utilize it real world, or maybe add a little bit of spiciness into their programming a little bit.
That's easier to come with accessory work and conditioning, like give them the spiciness there and just stay simple, hard, effective on the main stuff. Right. And that's a paradigm shift for a lot of people.
But then what I've also seen is like in the military, there's this emphasis on like endurance, not just because there's a 2-mile run in the Army Combat Fitness Test, but because, they do have to move over some distances regardless of what anybody thinks. Like the aerobic component, I mean, there have been some studies connecting that aerobic ability to an injury reduction.
Of course. I would even argue, like, the first thing I thought when you told your background of running half marathons is like, well, this guy had a great aerobic base.
Yeah.
he probably had a great work capacity, and he was able to transition that work capacity into the weight room and probably get far better gains or return on investment for the work because the aerobic base was there. And I think often in the strength world, we can be strength at all costs. And that's the other thing that we've had to fight over the last several years. Like we're not strength at all costs. We're strength first because that's where the return on investment is. And then of course, as people become more advanced and therefore less general and more specialized, then you specialize it to what they want. If they want to go do mud runs, if they want to do half marathons or 5Ks or cycling or whatever, then you can do that. But we never leave the strength. The strength is still the foundation of the program. And then we add the things to get them where they're supposed to go.
Right.
So how popular is the class? Like, is the class filling up quick? Are you asking people to join the class? Or is it at this point, is there enough word of mouth that the kids are kind of fighting to get in? Like, hey man, there's only 20 openings this round. We're trying to get in the class.
It's pretty popular to the point where I'll get asked by the folks who are registrar or the folks who populate the classes, can I add an extra seat? Can we go up to 21, 22? And I'm always like, absolutely.
Nice.
I think even last year, we even had a class that has like, it was close to 30. And I'm like, where did all these people come from? Like, what?
That's cool.
Like, I didn't approve this, but I'm not going to complain.
Yep.
Because more is better for sure. But I think it's one of the more popular lifetime physical activity courses. I think the most popular one, something like scuba, because
right. It's a lot of fun.
You get to go underwater and you get to go to Florida.
I didn't think I would like that. I did that and I was like, this is actually great.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love it. One of the things that you and I are talking about behind the scenes, we won't get into it in the podcast, is that it's part of the lifetime fitness piece, lifetime physical fitness piece that, we're trying to talk behind the scenes. So you get them for 19 sessions. The goal is for them to continue to do this for life.
Yes.
For life, because it's a life change. And what are the things that need to be put in place to help? Is there even a way to track long-term compliance or consistency? Because there was this thing for me, I remember it was often with your best athletes or even the ones that weren't the most genetically gifted, but the ones who worked the hardest for 4 years in high school. And then they got out and you saw them 3 years later and they've got the college beer belly and they didn't do, and you're just like, bro, you had so much potential, And so it's like, how do you continue this? You really invest in them enough to change their mindset so that they continue to be able to do this on their own, I think is really the goal there.
It is the goal. I would like to think that we would be able to embed it more before they take that PE 215 Foundations of Personal Fitness class, but that's aspirational just because
sure,
when they join the academy or any unit, they have to go through a level of initial entry training and what we call cadet basic training at West Point, which is concluding next week.
Yep.
It's 6 weeks, right? That's super short. It's really 4 weeks of training. And what I've come to realize trying to get these basic movement patterns embedded in some of these areas is basic trainings really just is an indoctrination.
Yeah.
And it's not really geared towards training as you and I would discuss it.
Sure.
Do some of those new cadets, as they're called at that time, get a training effect? Sure. Because they're so super novice.
Right.
Them picking up a 50-pound kettlebell and trying to, sumo deadlift it 2 times a week, that's a training effect for them.
Right.
However, it's not necessarily training for like the recruited core squad,
right,
Division I football player,
sure,
who can already squat 400 pounds.
Yeah, the kid was an all-state
exactly
football player at his high school. Like, it's not going to do anything for that kid.
No,
yeah,
not at all. So I've kind of come to realize why that's aspirational. Do I think strength would? And we've kicked around in my office trying to push for, hey, maybe we can get these cadets under a bar or over a bar 2 times a week.
Yep.
For 6 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is.
Mandatory.
How much would that improve
dramatically?
Not only physical performance, but mitigate injury.
Yep.
Right?
Of course.
So you're fighting the uphill battle, pushing the rock uphill because what has always been done, the actual intent of basic training, trying to get the strength movement, if you want to call it that, get some momentum, and places that we can get some momentum are classes like that personal fitness class 215 and the elective strength development class. What I love the strength development class to be a mandatory, everybody takes it. Yeah.
Sure.
But again, the academic schedule, the offerings and whatnot, it just doesn't jive real well with that and meet all the intent of that 215 class as well.
I think you're doing it the right way for the system that is in place, right? So it's set up as an elective right now.
Right.
So we know that and this is not, I'm a high on the Patriot scale, love being an American. but we know that the system is often a couple decades behind on some of this stuff.
Sure.
And so to take that as an elective course, if you can get good data from that and you can show over time that look at the improvement that we're making with these 100 kids per year, 100 cadets per year, and you're almost going to have to work backwards. What you'd really want is you'd want this in the ROTC program, in the high schools. You'd want this in the basic training piece. You'd want this in the mandatory piece. And then this strength development course becomes like more of an intermediate type. Like they already know all this stuff. Like we move into intermediate and advanced type stuff. In a perfect world, that's it. But I think in the system you live in, you start the opposite way. It's essentially a pilot program.
Yes.
And you work your way backwards. And we've learned from winning military, we actually just won another big military proposal last Friday. The thing that speaks to the military is combat readiness often. So the number of injuries that, and obviously it's one of the things, but when you're teaching strength training is that, we have 250,000, I think, at any given time, non-combat ready, physically injured, not emotionally injured, not PTSD. We're not talking about any of those. 250,000 American soldiers, warfighters, who are not combat ready, and 90% of the injuries are overuse injuries.
Yeah, for sure.
That's 100% avoidable.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can go, and one of the reasons I think that we've tend to do well with these proposals is the government, the US government, doesn't actually care how strong any of the warfighters are. But they do care if the American taxpayer is paying billions of dollars to keep them in a hospital bed or do physical therapy all day. And so if you can show the data that shows, look, if they do the thing, then the injury rate reduces by a 4x reduction, then it makes their ears perk up. And so you've had to learn, like, we want to get them stronger. That's the cool part. And of course, we don't want them injured either.
Yeah.
But in general, like the people that are reading the proposals and deciding whether you get it or not, they care about, are we actually making progress towards keeping them combat ready? And so I think you're doing it the right way, man. It's God's work. You're killing it. Again, we were super excited to hear the presentation. And I love that it's at West Point. I mean, listen, it's at this really prestigious, one of the most prestigious military academies in the United States. I think that makes a difference. And so you're doing great work. It's just going to be slow, right? Because it's the government. The government's slow.
It is.
And so you're always going to want to work faster. And, but I think you're making headway. And I love to hear what you're doing, for sure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast, man.
My pleasure.
Love it. It's been great. I hope to get out there and visit you soon. I'd love to see it in person. I think it'd be really cool. So
fall's a good time. Changing the leaves.
Oh, bro. New York is, it's beautiful out there. So that's been another episode of the Coaching Success Series on Barbell Logic. Again, this is Greg Hess, assistant professor, strength coach, athletic trainer, do-all Renaissance man.
You're too kind.
Lifter, previous half marathon runner, which I'm sure you don't do any of anymore. And so, listen, we know that our warfighters, our cadets, our soldiers, they need this terribly. And you're one of the good guys out there fighting the good fight against a lot of roadblocks and challenges, but it sounds like you're having a lot of success and a lot of popularity. And your personality is infectious. You look the part. I know you're super passionate about what you teach, and that is infectious and will continue to spread. And so I just see this continuing to grow. I'm excited for the day when you're like, I can't teach all these and we can't do all these, and we've got to double and triple and quadruple the number of courses we have. And so now you become the coach of coaches, and you've got a bunch of guys and ladies doing this, the same thing you're doing. And so I absolutely foresee that happening in the next several years. So thank you so much for being on the show, man. I'm excited for our audience to hear it.
Appreciate the opportunity. Last thing I'll say is presses over planks.
That's right. Presses over planks. Amazing what that does to your core, right?
Yes.
When you get that real long kinetic chain and you got all that weight over your head, like you don't actually have to do a plank. Isn't that amazing?
Exactly. 100%.
I love it. Simple, hard, effective. And you said lowest effective dose. I'm going to say minimum effective dose because that's right, but it's the same thing. We're cut from the same cloth. I think the hardest part of this is just teaching that paradigm shift to the cadet, to whether it's in the private sector or the public sector. Like, it's okay to be boring as long as we can keep adding weight to the bar. Like, what would you do? Like, how much money would you pay to go in the gym 4 times a week and put 5 pounds on the bar every single time?
A lot of money.
It's been decades since we've been able to do that. And so, for these people who are true novices, like, it gets so exciting. And I think that 19 sessions, my guess is by the time you get to the end of that, a bunch of them have caught the bug. And they're like, I really like putting 5 pounds on the bar. I want to keep doing this thing.
Yeah. And then you have to have the conversation of like, let's talk about what an intermediate is.
That's right. Which is a great conversation to have.
Yeah, it is.
You want to have more of those, not less. So Anyway, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you've gotten value out of this, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Hope you guys have a great weekend and a great week next week, and we'll see you guys next Friday.